Hello, I'm Susan Holman, the John R. Eckrich Chair in Religion and the Healing Arts at Valparaiso University. The work that I do looks at how Christians lived in the ancient world and how they thought about and practiced health, medicine, and well-being. I'm especially interested in how the ancient religious healthcare responses to illness might also speak to our care for the world today. In this talk, I offer a basic introduction to one of the most influential writers in ancient medicine, the second century Dr. Galen. This talk, which is part of a larger book project, considers Galen through a somewhat unusual lens: Christian material culture. If you want to learn more about medicine in the ancient world, I invite you to also perhaps download the further reading list associated with this presentation. The question that I'll reflect on throughout this talk is this: how do early Christians, in their stories, their art, their archaeology, their worship, claim Galen, use him, perhaps also adapt him even as they transmit his writings and his memories to later generations and cultures? So let's look at some images. For instance, here we see some vivid 13th century paintings from a church crypt in Rome, the Anagni Cathedral. But the subjects we're looking at here are not Jesus, the apostles, saints, or martyrs. They're about medicine and the natural world. The circles in this left panel name the four elements: fire, air, water, and earth, the four basic substances that people believed made up the created world and had to be balanced for good health. And here in this panel, we see the ancient doctors, Galen and Hippocrates, in conversation. These two were not Christians, they were not martyrs, they were not saints. I begin with this image, again, to invite us to wonder, how did Galen, as an ancient medical writer, become so important to the Christian tradition that religious painters would give him such space on a church wall? So the talk has three parts. First, a brief biography of Galen. Second, an even briefer summary of early Christian healthcare. And then third, several stories that illustrate Galen's Christian afterlives, that is, glimpses from material culture that illustrate Galen's memory and voice at the intersection of religion and health practices in history. So first, who was Galen? Galen was born in the Roman Empire in the city of Pergamum on the west coast of what is now Turkey. Pergamum was famous for its healing sanctuary to the god Asclepius. Galen was from a wealthy Greek-speaking family with a special devotion to Asclepius, seen here on the right in this ancient medicine box with his characteristic staff and beside the goddess Hygeia. A quick summary of Galen's life goes something like this. His father had a dream that ordered him to have Galen train in medicine. So Galen studied first in Pergamum, and then he went to Alexandria in Egypt, the best place in the Roman world for medical education. Returning home, he served as physician to gladiators in the local games. That would be good experience in basic anatomy, in wound care, in surgery, always risky in a world without antibiotics or anesthetics. He then moved to Rome, where he would live for most of his life as imperial physician to Marcus Aurelius and later emperors. Galen's one of our best sources on a terrible plague that he witnessed in the 160s. He knew about Christians and criticized them for what he saw as their blind faith, unlike his own dedication to hard evidence. But he also praised them as examples of moral strength. He collected medicines from around the world and he tried them out on his patients. In one letter, he tells how philosophy helped him during a time of political terrorism and when a fire destroyed his books and treasures. He died around 216, an old man, probably in his 80s. So with that brief overview, let's turn back and look a little bit more closely at the healthcare system in Galen's world and how it shaped his ideas and his writings, beginning with the healing complex to Asclepius in his hometown. There were many Asclepius sanctuaries in the Roman world, and the one at Pergamum is a good example of how they functioned. Here you see an architect's floor plan of the Pergamum complex with imagined therapeutic actions at the shrine. A sick person might worship in one of the temples to Apollo, Asclepius, or Hygeia. They might go to the theater or exercise along the colonnades here. At night, patients slept or incubated, waiting for dreams from the god to either heal them or tell them what to do when they woke up. And once healed, they might hang a votive offering of the body part that was healed, or they might pay for their story to be carved or written on the wall as a testimony to the god's power, as you see here. Galen revered Asclepius. He mentions a few personal healings, but he would in fact focus his medical career on what we today call evidence-based care. He was a man with great self-confidence. He radiated authority to those around him, and he was quick to criticize other doctors' errors. Proper diagnosis and treatment, he insisted, calls for close observation of the patient, their social environment, and evidence about what works or not in each case. He was a prolific writer, including many commentaries on early Hippocratic texts. And here you see a fragment of one of these commentaries that was copied only a short time after he died. At least 150 of his works survive, often in fragments, on every conceivable topic in medicine. His writings are full of stories about cases and evidence that led to diagnosis and treatment. He also insisted that the best physician must be well trained in philosophy. Galen defined health as many would today, a state in which we have no pain and are not impeded in the activities of our lives we refer to as health. Unimpaired functioning is the best definition, he says. Now, this may sound much like the definition in the World Health Organization's Constitution from 1946 on the right. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. You might want to take time later to compare, perhaps, these two definitions with your own views on health, thinking about how modern ideas, maybe of pain, for example, might be different for the ancient world, or how these compare with modern disability theories. Galen interpreted health largely through the humoral theory common to Hippocratic medicine, health as a balance of internal humors based on the elements, environmental forces, the cosmos, life stages, as well as individual choice and action. He believed the soul was part of the body, and the body was part of the cosmos. Galen's first book was about the anatomy of the womb, a book he says he gave to a local midwife in Pergamum. But his knowledge of anatomy was limited to cutting live animals, apes, pigs, goats, and the occasional chance he had, he says, he describes here, the breaking open of a grave or tomb, grabbing a dead body. This is why many of his anatomical explanations on human persons are wrong, though it was centuries before the doctors who depended on him understood this really carefully. It was only in the 16th century that another court physician, Andreas Vesalius, corrected Galen in great detail using drawings like this one on the right from his famous book, The Fabrica. Vesalius was attacked for daring to call Galen wrong. And I won't say more about him here, but Vesalius is very important to the later history of Galenic medicine. If you got sick in the ancient world, a doctor would only be one of many options in the medical marketplace. No one had health insurance, doctors were not licensed, a healer's influence depended on her or his reputation, which depended on public image and success. If the doctor thought your case was hopeless, he could refuse to treat you, so your death did not make him look bad. This meant that the poor often depended on cheaper therapies, and professional doctors like Galen were often accused of being greedy. All these factors would shape the appeal of Christian healing, since it was presented as free and open to everyone. Let's turn now to look briefly at the rise of organized medical care in the Christian tradition. Most of Jesus' gospel miracles address some type of illness. By the 2nd century, Jesus was increasingly compared with Asclepius as the great physician. The account of his death and resurrection were also explained in terms of cosmic healing and power over body and soul. Missionaries, martyrs, and by the 3rd and 4th century, monks and nuns who went out into the desert to become more holy were often seen as healers because they had faithfully suffered hardship, violence, or death. Their stories of holiness might also mention ordinary doctors and natural medicine, sometimes positively, sometimes not. By the 4th century, Christians were establishing healthcare institutions for the poor, like this one by Basil of Caesarea, that included some features we today connect with clinical care. Rooms of beds, sick strangers, dirty linen, the importance of food, charitable aid, ethics, and nursing attendance. Other things we might expect are actually missing or seem to be missing. There are few, if any, trained caregivers. It's unclear what the fiscal and structural models were. There's no privacy, and of course, no antibiotics, and there seems to be no pharmacy. Further, these institutions might support things we would condemn: slavery, gender bias, class discrimination, and sometimes religious violence. Churches, too, doubled as healing places. This chapel in Rome has painted images of full-length doctors and holy healers around its 4 walls. Some suggest this room was used like an incubation shrine, where the sick would sleep and pray for healing. Galen's value for philosophy was shared by a number of Christian healers and bishops as vital for overall health. One example of Galen's influence on these Christian philosophers is in a 4th century treatise on the nature of man by Nemesius, Bishop of Amasa. Speaking about the soul, Nemesius points to Plato and to Aristotle, but also to Galen, whom he calls the marvelous physician. In summary, then, both Galen and the early Christians' world combined religious healing with material medical practice. We'll see more of these overlaps in the stories. So let's turn now to these stories. Around the year 500, there was a rich princess named Anicia Juliana who lived in the city of Constantinople. A Christian faithful to the Council of Chalcedon, Juliana dared to stand up even to the emperor when she disagreed with him about theology. She was also a generous donor for what she believed in, and she'd recently funded the construction of a new church for a local community. In gratitude, the church commissioned this book as a thank you gift. Weighing in at 14 pounds, the book has nearly 500 vellum folio pages, each with texts on one side and on the other a full-color illustration. Juliana herself appears on this page, where you see a small Puto figure presenting her with the book. Around this image, the scribe had written in tiny white letters you can't see here the following dedication. Hail, O Princess, the community of Honorotai extols and glorifies you with all fine praises, for magnanimity allows you to be mentioned over the entire world. You belong to the family of the Anicia, and you have built a temple of the Lord, raised high and beautiful. But what is this book? Given such praise of what we know of Juliana, we might expect a religious book. But no, in fact, 380 folios contain a book on medicinal plants by the first-century writer Dioscorides. Dioscorides collected anecdotes about healing plants while he was traveling with the Roman army. Illustrated and handwritten, his De Materia Medica would become a standard reference well into the 17th century and later. Thus, Juliana's richly illustrated copy is entirely about healthcare remedies and the natural world. And even in the last 110 pages, where she would read a poem, she could read a poem on plants, she could read an illustrated treatise on birds. Here you see a page sample, and another one on snake bites. Dioscorides wrote before Galen was born, so you might not expect this book to say anything about Galen. But take a look at this sample page from a facsimile, here opened to the plant ambrosia, painted on the left. On the right, facing page, you can see several blocks of Greek text in both capital letters and unsealed script. The writing consisted, of course, of Dioscorides' advice about this plant's medicinal qualities. And also what Galen said. Here I've circled some lines that make this clear, even if you can't read Greek. There are 4 lines in capital letters with the heading Galenos, or from Galen. In other words, Dioscorides is supplemented, and for each plant, Galen's remarks accompany the main image. The book also illustrates the importance of ancient doctors. In these 2 pages at the beginning, each contains 7 physicians sitting in a circle. On the right page, circled in yellow, Galen takes pride of place at the top, with Dioscorides relegated to his left, as the next figure clockwise to the viewer's right. This model of imaging famous ancient doctors, even when the text doesn't contain anything they wrote, occurs in other books too. Here, for example, are the 2 famous Greek healing gods, Asclepius, with a halo no less, and Apollo on the right. This is from an herbal that dates around 800 from a monastery in Western Europe. On another page, the artist has painted Hippocrates, seen here. Though again, this book does not contain Hippocratic texts. When you browse through the book online, you will see this pair of facing pages. On the left is a text about plants and serpents that continues over to the top of the right page. And on this right page, as if drawn later into the empty space, there's a sketch identified on the book's figure that he holds as Galenos, or Galen. This sketch is rough compared with all the other pages. We don't know when it was drawn or why it remained unpainted. But I think it's curious that someone in this Christian community chose to add Galen in a book that also illustrates the very same Greek healers, Asclepius and Apollo, that Galen himself would have worshipped at Pergamum, as well as Hippocrates, Galen's model for much of his own writings. Returning to Juliana's book, modern readers often wonder how she might have used it in practice. Leslie Brubaker suggests perhaps Juliana's religious testiness or convictions prompted the people who commissioned the book to opt for a safe, non-religious text. Alternatively, we might suspect, she says, that the gift hinted at a need for a hospice. What is significant is the expectations that a woman running a large and wealthy household should appreciate a deluxe medical text. We do know that this book and Galen's advice in it was used in healthcare for centuries. Handwritten notes in the book say it was used in a hospital so often that the binding wore out. It was rebound in 1406. That same year, someone else added a new table of contents, and by 1453, there were notes naming all the plants in Arabic and Hebrew. By the 1500s, under Islamic rule, a Jewish doctor, Moses Holman, owned it and worked for the Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent. Soon after that, it was sold to a Flemish diplomat who took it to Vienna, where it remains today, a UNESCO treasure. Our second case begins in the city of Alexandria during Princess Juliana's lifetime. And here we'll look at Galen through the life and work of a doctor priest named Sergius of Rashina. By the year 500, Alexandria was still the place for the best medical education. Teachers and students included Christians as well as Hellenes, or those who still worshiped the Greek and other gods. We know what these schools looked like because archaeologists have uncovered this area, seen here, more than a city block of purpose-built stone classrooms. Within this vast complex of teaching spaces, each classroom was designed with tiered seats around a speaker area at the front where teachers could lecture on medicine, philosophy, and other subjects. A number of lecture or student notes survive, and you see one example here on the right. Such classrooms continued for use in medical training into the 8th century, and across this period followed a very particular curriculum. We know the curriculum thanks to two sources from the 9th and the 11th centuries, summarized here. They outline the required readings and their assigned sequence as taught in Alexandria between 500 and 700. The student experience was a bit different from a medical school today. There was flexibility in attendance, who you studied with, when you left, and there were no degrees. Anatomy teachers faced the same limits that Galen had. The focus was on learning texts. What both of these lists reveal in slightly different forms is a curriculum that's almost 100% Galen. There's a bit of Aristotle, a bit of Hippocrates, but Hippocrates is taught using Galen's commentaries, and this is the curriculum that would shape medical education into the Islamic world and into the West by the 12th and 13th centuries. Thus, in the view of most educated men at this time, it was Galen's writings that were held as ideal, whether you could read them or not. Sergius, who died in 536, was a priest who learned medicine here in Alexandria with this curriculum. He then used his skills and knowledge of these texts to do something that had an even longer lasting impact. He translated them. The Alexandrians spoke Greek, and Sergius was from a region that also spoke Syriac. He was part of a movement to translate both medical and Christian texts into Syriac, and in many cases, this was the only way some texts we know about today survived at all. Those who knew Sergius remembered him as, quote, a philosopher, translator of books, interpreter of books, translator and interpreter of books, author of many works, and he was also a doctor. We don't know much else about his personal life or his practice, except that one later chronicler praised him for his eloquent learning and criticized him for being lascivious and greedy. But whatever his morals, his translations played a huge role in continuing Galen's heritage. Sergius' work informed another important Christian translator from Baghdad 300 years later, Hunayn ibn Ishaq. Hunayn leaves us a very long and useful list of more than 100 Galen texts that he had seen or translated. And in this list, he says he has read translations from Sergius of at least 26. Sergius did not just pass on Galen's words. In introducing one of his Galen translations, Sergius tells the reader why he values the work so highly, and incidentally, why food is the key to effective medicine. We find this note in his translation of Galen's commentary on Hippocrates' work on nutriment, or the value of food. Here Sergius writes that one ought to count this book as the most excellent of the books on medicine, because if the physician knows it, he does not need anything else. Moreover, there are some indigent among the populace and those who can't take drugs because of their high cost or their unavailability, and they can make do with food instead. Therefore, it's requisite upon the physician to have knowledge of this book. Indeed, praise is due to the physician who does without drugs, but replaces them with foodstuffs. That is the skilled physician. Thus, Sergius notes his concern for practical health for ordinary people, including the indigent, the poor. And he reminds us, something still true today, that a health provider should also know both nutrition, science, and the social conditions that affect their patients' access to care. We'll revisit another of Sergius's translations shortly. Cross-cultural connections appear again in our next case, Galenic medicine along the Silk Roads into China. There is an 18th century tradition in Tibetan medicine of a supposedly 8th century legend that, quote, when the king was ill, an Indian and Chinese doctor and the Roman doctor Galen were invited to Tibet to cure him. Galen stayed on as royal physician. Another version of this story survives in a text called Sefer Asaph, a Hebrew book of remedies from the 8th or 9th century that may also have roots in the Church of the East. Sefer Asaph tells how medicine was rediscovered after being lost at the time of Noah and the flood, and claims that, quote, in the days of Artaxerxes, the king, Hippocrates and Asaph, the Jew, and Dioscorides and Galen, and many other sages renewed the glory of medicine, and it is living till this day. Both quotes, taken here from Ronit Yoli Tlalim's recent study, Reorienting Histories of Medicine, are just about all we know of early claims that Galen or Galenic medicine reached the Far East around the 8th century. Yoeli Tlalim affirms that medicine with Greek roots came to China via what was known as Islamic medicine, although she says the conveyors of that medical knowledge were often members of the Church of the East. In fact, she says, a Chinese compendium called Muslim Medicinal Recipes attributes some of its content to one Zhao Linuxi, the Chinese transliteration of Galen. These legends of Galenic presence in China early are hard to prove. They're late, 14th century, 15th century. Yet they do point to a time when we know Christians were traveling east, settling in Tibet and China as early as the 7th and 8th centuries. And where bodies travel, bodies get sick, typically choosing remedies from their cultural home traditions. The 7th century Christians who went to China included those who left the Byzantine Empire because of theological differences and political repression. From Persia, some of these Church of the East Christians came to China, either as merchants, missionaries, or refugees. They left evidence of their presence in several places along the way, particularly at Dunhuang and further east at Chiang. In 1908, Christian texts were found in a Buddhist library cave at Dunhuang, along with a vast archive of Indian, Buddhist, Manichaean, and other medical texts, all dating before the 11th century. This 8th century hymn in Chinese characters found in the cave praises the Christian Trinity. Other Dunhuang manuscripts include the Psalms in Syriac and other worship texts. The best known proof of Christians in early China is this 9-foot tall stone inscription from Chiang, commonly called the Nestorian stele. Inscribed in Chinese and Syriac, seen on the right, it dates to 781 and tells how Christian monks settled in that region in the 600s. Neither the Dunhuang Christian manuscripts nor the Qian stele name Galen. But the legends alongside these material fragments do, I think, invite us to imagine Syriac healers from Sergius' time among those travelers, and maybe, just maybe, bringing with them their books of practical medicine, which might have included texts, excerpts, or even simply just the name of Galen. So far, these stories all affirm Galen as the ideal medic, but for some Christians, he was the bad guy. One example is a 7th century collection of miracle healings from the Christian incubation shrine of St. Cyrus and John at Manuthis on the coast just north of Alexandria. 6 of the 70 stories in this text mention Galen or his contemporaries, in all cases condemning them as wrongly trusting natural things and not giving proper credit to God and the saints for their ultimate powers to heal. These are 3 representations from those 6 stories. Each of the 6 stories names an individual patient. Each patient had paid physicians who took their money, but then said they were incurable. Each traveled to the shrine where Saints Cyrus and John healed for free, and each was cured. These quotes reflect the tone of this text. In Miracle 13:2, the leper Elias, Sophronius writes, says he got no relief from Hippocrates, Galen, and Democritus, bastard brothers of nature, naturally inefficient. When a woman, Stephanas, turned to the doctors for her cancer, those shining stars in the line of Galen and Hippocrates showed their natural perversity, he says, when they pronounced her incurable. And young Sarapamon came to the saints after his father promised a lot of money to those preening Galen and boasting Hippocratic cures who failed him. Clearly, not everyone in late antiquity thought Galen was the best thing going for your body and soul. Our final case brings us back to Sergius of Rashina, in a bridge to 21st century technology. This case reveals how Galen's voice was, at least in one instance, literally erased. This is the story of the Syriac Galen palimpsest. One of Sergius's translations was Galen's treatise on the mixtures and powers of simple drugs. Simple drugs meant single ingredient pharmaceuticals, plants or substances that could stand alone as drugs without being mixed into elaborate recipes. Scholars knew that Galen's Greek original had contained 11 books, that books 1 to 5 were his theory, and books 6 to 11 were his practice. But until a few years ago, the earliest copy, which was known only in Syriac in a British library manuscript, contained only books 6 to 8. The whole treatise could be reconstructed from extant Greek manuscripts, but they, too, were late. So medical historians could not really be sure how the original parts fit together. This knowledge gap shifted radically in the early 2000s, when an old manuscript, seen here, was rediscovered, now called the Syriac Galen palimpsest, or SGP. Here's an image, which is not from this particular palimpsest, that vividly illustrates what a palimpsest is. It's a book where one or more texts were written onto the same page. The earlier text later erased so the scribe could reuse the sheet again. In palimpsests, the original undertext, here the image, are faintly visible, and digital technology now makes it possible to recover them without damaging the paper. So the digital work here is done by the Sinai Palimpsest project. The SGP's undertext, so this is the SGP on the right here. Its undertext turned out to be a virtually complete 9th century copy of Sergius's Syriac translation of Galen's Book of Simple Drugs. The story of its journey across time is a stark reminder that access to history is not straightforward. The first scribe, for instance, copied Sergius's Galen somewhere in Syria between 800 and 1000. Probably a monk in a monastery northwest of Antioch who wanted Galen's medicine for the library. Then 200 years later, they needed writing material for a different text that they were going to be using on weekdays in church worship. They lacked our privilege of putting in a quick order for paper, so they recycled the Galen by erasing it to add the service book on top with hymns, odes, and prayers they needed, also in Syriac. Here you see a 2-page spread of the new text. The community then used this liturgy for another 200 years. And then for some reason, the book was donated to St. Catherine's Monastery at Sinai, where it remained for 600 years or so until disappearing, possibly borrowed or stolen in the 18th or 19th century. It reappeared in Leipzig, Germany in 1922, when a manuscript dealer sold most of it. The new owner put the book into a storage box for 20 years. After World War II, it came to the United States and was sold again in 2002. The current owner made it freely available digitally, allowing scholars to safely recover the undertext. Thanks to the multispectral and digital image tools of the Syriac Galen Palimpsest project, with a team of scholars based in the UK and directed by Professor Peter Porman, this book was found to contain the long-erased text of Galen's Simple Drugs. A new edition and translation is currently in the works. The SGP brings us closer than we've ever been to Galen's original text, uniting his theory with his praxis. It also stands as a vivid piece of material evidence for how Christian history and liturgical practices intersect literally with the history of medicine. Both texts, now visible, witness to monastic communities that treasured them, and to the more than 200 years when a community of monks, day after day, unknowingly, carried Galen into church, chanting and praying with the very pages on which this ancient doctor had explained in detail the medicinal healing powers of the natural world. In conclusion, these stories are just a few examples of what I've called Galen's Christian afterlives. My focus here has been on Christian history, but we must remember that Galen also influenced other religious traditions, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, and all share a value for natural science and medicine, for learning about the nature of God, for creation of the world and the human body. It's these religious traditions that helped preserve and pass on Galen's value for evidence-based science in healthcare, long before microscopes or germ theory. Physicians were only a small part of the medical marketplace of late antiquity. I haven't said anything here, for instance, about women's health, surgery, pediatrics, disability perspectives, public health, or the many other practices of ordinary illiterate people in the ancient world. Things we might call folk medicine or magic also, in fact, may mention Galen's authority. Finally, why should we care? These stories matter, I argue, because religion continues to influence how people view the medical system. You may remember how the COVID pandemic sparked debates about vaccination, worship gatherings, and religious food rituals. Religion still informs views on blood, on genetics, women's health, medical technologies, and the environment. Listening to such voices from the past, I think, may help sensitize us to appreciating cultural differences across time and in our worlds today. And once again, I invite you, perhaps using the further reading list, to explore some of the many resources available on health and healing in the history of religion and the medical arts. Thank you.